Brinkmanship is the idea of taking something to the edge and backing off, like a game of chicken. When you see a bully threaten to fight somebody, but then when the person says, sure, let's fight, and the bully backs down, that's brinkmanship. In the nuclear age, brinkmanship between countries can be a very dangerous game. However, those same weapons can become a deterrent to war because of the fear of mutual assured destruction. A deterrent is something that prevents behavior, like the fear of getting a ticket deters me from going 150 kilometers an hour. Nuclear weapons were being developed in both Germany and the US during World War II. The war in Europe was already winding down by the time the Americans had perfected their weapon, and the use of such a weapon of mass destruction was seen as justified as the only way to end the war in Japan. Of course, that's highly debated. The Soviets were able to build their bomb a few years after the end of World War II. When the Soviets successfully launched the first missile into space in 1957 that carried the satellite Sputnik, that changed the game altogether. You no longer needed to physically deliver the weapon yourself, you could just launch it on one of those missiles. Those intercontinental ballistic missiles were eventually developed to have the capacity to accurately send a weapon around the world in 30 minutes. MAD stands for Mutual Assured Destruction. Both the Soviets and the US set up radar bases so they could detect a missile on its way long before it entered your airspace. Canada signed the NORAD Treaty with the United States to share airspace and allow the US to set up radar bases in northern Canada known as the DEW line, or Distant Early Warning. You gotta remember, the fastest way for the USSR to the US would be over the North Pole, so those northern air bases are very important. With the establishment of these radar bases, the threat was, if you hit me, I'll hit you, so no one wins. These powerful weapons now became tools of defense instead of offense. No one really wanted to use one because of MAD. That deterrence meant that the superpowers never launched a missile at each other, even though there were government officials in both countries that wanted to. Instead, the two superpowers, along with a handful of other nations, built up their stockpiles and improved their nuclear technology as a protection for their nation state. This leads us back again to the idea of brinkmanship, and the classic example of brinkmanship during the Cold War is the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a conflict over spheres of influence in the Caribbean. To the Cubans, this event is just one in a long line of conflicts with the Americans since the communist revolution of Castro. When Cuba became communist, they became strong allies with the Soviet Union. This thrilled the Soviets because the Americans had the advantage with their European sphere of influence pushing right up against the Soviet bloc, while until this point, the Soviets really had nothing close to the Americans. When an American U-2 spy plane discovers nuclear missile sites in Cuba, the president is unsure of what to do. His military advisors told him to invade Cuba, providing the dual opportunity of overthrowing Castro and telling the Soviets to get out of their sphere of influence. But a year before, Kennedy had been convinced to support the Bay of Pigs invasion, where they had Cuban exiles in the United States trained and supplied with weapons in an attempt to overthrow the communist government. It failed miserably. And of course, the atmosphere created by McCarthyism meant that Kennedy couldn't look soft on communism, but he also isn't wanting to walk into a war with the Soviets. Eventually, a decision is made, and Kennedy announces to the world that the U.S. is going to quarantine the island nation in order to prevent supplies from getting to the Cubans until the missiles are removed. That word quarantine was used because a blockade is an official act of war and could have led to World War III. We can see today the Americans are very good at using semantics to get around international rules, like the detainee camps in Guantanamo Bay, but that's a whole nother lesson. For the next 2 weeks, UN diplomacy, backroom deals, and public threats put the entire world on edge. One night, a telegram is sent from the USSR saying, "Mr. President, we and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knot will be tied. Let us take measures to untie that knot." And it was signed by Khrushchev. Yet the next morning, another telegram was sent rejecting the idea of diplomacy and threatening the Americans. This sort of behavior confused both sides and made the hawks, people who see war as a viable option, even more agitated. On October 28th, an agreement is signed where the Soviets agree to remove missiles from Cuba, and the US will remove some from Turkey. The American public wasn't told about this at first. This is the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war. One US government official is reported to have said, "We were eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked." The world breathed a sigh of relief, but in the USSR, Khrushchev is seen as soft on liberalism and is eventually pushed out of power. After this close call, the two superpowers decided to take some action towards a détente. That means an end to hostility. Now, the Cold War lasted decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the establishment of a hotline in 1963 would allow the leaders in Moscow and Washington to speak to each other directly. That would prevent misunderstandings that had prolonged this conflict and led to brinkmanship. As well, they signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty that same year that slowed down the nuclear arms race. Other countries eventually developed their own nuclear technology, and there's some debate as to whether the proliferation or spread of nuclear weapons does in fact make the world more dangerous, or does it actually make the world a more peaceful place, as mutual assured destruction requires nations to consider diplomacy as their only option, because a war would lead to their own destruction.